The house felt different now. Once filled with the warmth of laughter, the scent of home-cooked meals, and the hum of an old radio playing soft melodies, it had become a place of silence and shadows. The once vibrant walls now seemed dull and aged, much like the mind of its oldest resident, Tom, a once spirited man whose memory was slowly being swallowed by the relentless tide of Alzheimer's disease. His son, Peter, had taken it upon himself to be his caretaker. It wasn't just a duty, it was an obligation born out of love and guilt. Every morning, Peter followed the same routine, preparing breakfast, setting out Tom's favorite sweater, and patiently answering the same questions over and over again. "Where's your mother?" Tom would ask, his voice trembling with confusion. Peter would take a deep breath, forcing a gentle smile. "She's gone, Dad. It's been years." And every time, Tom's reaction was the same, a brief moment of shock, then grief, then forgetting all over again. It was like watching someone relive the worst day of their life. Every single morning. But lately, things had gotten worse. It wasn't just Tom's failing memory, it was something else. Something Peter couldn't explain. Doors left open at night, though Peter was certain he had locked them. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, even though only the two of them lived in the house. The cold spots that lingered in the corners of the living room, making Peter's skin prickle. And then, there was Tom's unsettling behavior. Some nights, Peter would wake up to find his father standing by the window, whispering to the darkness outside. "They're calling me," Tom murmured one evening, his eyes vacant. Peter's stomach tightened. "Who, Dad?" Tom simply turned, his expression eerily serene. "The ones I forgot." The words sent a chill down Peter's spine. He tried to convince himself that it was just his father's deteriorating mind, that there was nothing there. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. And soon, it would make itself known. The strange occurrences in the house continued, growing more frequent and unnerving. Peter tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just the stress of caring for Tom. Maybe he was imagining things. But deep down, an unease settled in his chest, a gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the night that changed everything. It started as a quiet evening. Much like the others, Peter had just put Tom to bed, checking the locks twice before sitting down with a cup of coffee. The house was still, except for the faint creak of wood as it settled. He let out a sigh, trying to shake the tension that had been gripping him for days. But then, a sound. A faint scraping noise, like claws against metal. Peter's eyes darted to the front door, heart pounding. It was coming from outside. Slowly, he approached the window and peered out. The dim porch light barely illuminated the yard. But in the shadows, he saw movement. Something shifting near the rusty gate at the edge of the property. And then, he saw it. A dog sat there, its muscular body still as stone, watching him with intense amber eyes. Its coat was a mix of brown and white, the fur around its muzzle scarred as if it had seen battles long forgotten. Peter's pulse quickened. He had never seen this dog before. Most strays roamed restlessly, looking for food or shelter, but this one? It sat perfectly still, staring directly at the house. At him. Then, as if sensing Peter's hesitation, the dog stood up. It took a few slow steps forward, its massive paws pressing into the damp earth. Peter swallowed. Something about this dog felt different, intelligent, almost too aware. Before he could react, the front door creaked open behind him. Peter spun around, heart leaping to his throat, and there stood Tom, his frail fingers wrapped around the doorknob. His eyes were vacant yet focused, not on Peter, but on the dog outside. "Dad, what are you doing?" Peter rushed forward, trying to guide his father back inside. But Tom didn't move. Instead, in a voice that sent a shiver down Peter's spine, he murmured, "He's here." Peter froze. "What?" Tom reached for the lock. "No, Dad, wait." Click. The gate swung open, and the dog stepped inside. Peter's breath caught as the massive creature strode forward with purpose, stopping just at the threshold of the house. Its intense eyes met his. And for a split second, Peter had the overwhelming sense that this dog wasn't just any dog. And then, Tom knelt down. With trembling hands, he reached out. The dog hesitated, then leaned into his touch, pressing its broad head against Tom's palm. A strange calmness settled over Tom's face, as if a part of him recognized the animal. as if it was something he had been waiting for all along. Peter watched, his skin crawling, because for the first time in months, Tom's voice was clear and certain when he whispered, "Luke, you finally found me." Peter stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. His father, Tom, had been lost in the haze of Alzheimer's for years, unable to recall even the simplest details. And yet, as he knelt before the strange pit bull, he had spoken the dog's name with absolute certainty. Luke. Peter's mind raced. How could Tom know this dog? There was no memory, no photograph, nothing that suggested his father had ever owned a pit bull. But Tom's trembling hands gently stroked the dog's broad head, his eyes shimmering with something Peter had not seen in a long time, clarity. "You remember him?" Peter asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his fingers gripping the dog's fur as if anchoring himself to reality. "He was always meant to come back," he muttered, "to watch over us." A chill ran down Peter's spine. Then, a sound from inside the house. A soft creak, followed by a shuffling noise, like something moving in the hallway. Peter's heart slammed against his ribs. Someone was in the house. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was just the old wood settling. Maybe it was his imagination, fueled by exhaustion. But Luke heard it too. The pit bull's ears snapped upright. His muscles tensed. His amber eyes shifted away from Tom and locked onto the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms. Peter's fingers instinctively curled into fists. He hadn't heard the front door open. He had been standing right there. No one could have gotten in. And yet, there was movement in the darkness. Tom, still kneeling, suddenly gripped Peter's wrist. His fingers were cold. His voice, though quiet, carried an urgency that sent goosebumps down Peter's arms. "He's here." Peter's mouth went dry. "Who's here?" Tom didn't answer. He only pointed toward the hallway. Luke let out a low growl, his lips peeling back to reveal sharp, gleaming teeth. His entire posture shifted, from a calm companion to a guardian ready for battle. Peter reached for the closest thing he could find, a heavy brass candlestick from the entryway table. He stepped forward, his breath shaky. The hallway was pitch black, save for the dim sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. Something was there, watching, waiting. Peter forced himself forward, Luke matching his every step. Then, a whisper, so faint, Peter almost thought he imagined it. But it was there, a voice, breathy and distorted, slipping through the shadows. "Tom." Peter's body went rigid. Luke's growl deepened, his entire frame rigid with tension. The dog's hackles rose like bristles on a brush. Peter turned back to Tom, expecting to see fear, but instead, his father sat unnervingly still, his eyes fixed on the darkness. And then, Tom spoke again. But the words that left his mouth made Peter's blood turn to ice. "You were never supposed to come back." Peter's grip on the brass candlestick tightened, his knuckles turning white. The whisper had been faint, almost like a breath carried on the wind. But he had heard it. And so had Luke. The pit bull remained deathly still, his growl now nothing more than a low, guttural vibration deep in his chest. His eyes burned into the dark hallway as if he could see something Peter could not. Tom, still seated on the floor, did not move. His expression was eerily neutral. His lips parted slightly, as if he were caught in a memory or a trance. Peter swallowed hard. "Dad, what do you mean?" His voice barely carried, but it still felt too loud in the suffocating silence. Tom blinked slowly. Then, in a voice that was barely his own, he murmured, "It's not real, Peter. It was never real." A floorboard creaked. Peter snapped his head up, staring into the inky void of the hallway. His muscles locked as he listened, waiting. Luke took a slow step forward, his massive frame blocking Peter protectively. The pit bull's entire body vibrated with tension, as if one wrong move would send him lunging into the darkness. Peter's heartbeat hammered in his ears. Then, the whisper returned. "Tom, you left me behind." Peter's breath hitched. This time, he was sure it was inside the house. He turned sharply toward Tom, expecting to see fear, confusion, anything but what he saw instead. Tom was smiling, not a normal, warm smile, but a slow, almost knowing grin, as if he had expected this all along. His fingers twitched against his knees, his eyes remaining fixed on the hallway. Peter's stomach knotted. "Dad." A shape moved. Peter's body went rigid. He couldn't see it, not entirely, but something shifted at the far end of the hallway. Deeper in the darkness, a shadow, tall and thin, but wrong. His fingers tightened around the candlestick. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run. And then, Tom whispered, "It's him." Luke lunged. A sudden, deafening snarl ripped through the air. The pit bull charging toward the darkness with unrelenting force. His powerful muscles propelled him forward. And Peter barely had time to react before. Bang! The bedroom door slammed shut before Luke could reach it. The entire house shook from the force. The sound reverberated through the walls like a gunshot, sending Peter staggering back. Luke skidded to a stop, his nails scratching against the hardwood floor. His snarls did not stop, his eyes still locked on the closed door. Peter's breaths came in short, uneven gasps. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. But deep down, he knew there was something inside that room, and it was waiting. Peter turned to his father, his chest heaving. "Dad, who is in there?" Tom's expression finally changed. The eerie smile faded, replaced by something far more unsettling, regret. His voice dropped to a whisper, almost too quiet to hear. "I never told you about the other one." Peter's breath hitched. "The other what, Dad?" Tom didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained locked on the closed bedroom door, his expression shadowed by something Peter couldn't quite name. Fear? Guilt? Meanwhile, Luke did not budge. The pit bull stood planted like a sentry, his growls continuous, his gaze unwavering. He knew there was something behind that door. Peter took a slow, measured step toward his father, his voice trembling. "Dad, who is in that room?" Tom exhaled shakily, his fingers twitching. "Not who," he whispered. "What?" Peter's pulse slammed against his ribs. "Dad, stop talking in riddles. Just tell me." Tom finally looked at him. "I had a brother, Peter." His voice was a ghost of itself. Weak, fragile. His name was Adam. Peter felt the room tilt beneath him. "You, what?" Tom nodded, his movements slow, distant. "He was my twin, identical in every way. But Adam, he wasn't like me. He was different, darker." He swallowed, his throat working as if it pained him to say the words. "And one day, he disappeared." Peter tried to process this. He had never heard his father mention a brother before, never. Not once. His grandfather had died before Peter was born. His grandmother soon after. There was no record, no memory, nothing. "I was just a boy when it happened," Tom continued, voice shaking. "One night, we were playing outside in the yard. There was this old well near the trees. Mom always told us to stay away from it." He blinked slowly, as if the memory was coming alive before his eyes. Adam didn't listen. A sharp bang rattled the house. Peter jumped, and Luke barked wildly, his body pressing against the bedroom door, as if trying to hold something in. Tom didn't even flinch. He just continued. "I told him not to get too close. But he laughed, said there was something at the bottom calling his name. He climbed up, leaning over the edge, and then, Peter's stomach turned. "Dad, what happened?" Tom finally met his son's eyes. He fell in. A sudden chill gripped Peter's spine. Tom let out a hollow breath. "We searched for days, but there was no trace of him. No body, no explanation." His fingers twisted against his knees, as if trying to hold something in. "But I never forgot what I saw right before he disappeared." The house creaked, the wooden beams groaning under an unseen weight. Luke let out a low whimper, his stance shifting. Peter felt frozen in place. "What did you see?" Tom's face was ashen, haunted by something decades old. "His reflection," he whispered, "in the water at the bottom of the well. It wasn't right. He swallowed, his voice breaking. "It smiled at me, but Adam wasn't smiling." Peter's stomach lurched. Then he was just gone. Tom shook his head, his fingers digging into his arms. "Everyone said he was dead, that he drowned, but I always knew the truth." Peter's mind reeled. "And that is?" Tom's hands clenched. "That thing in the well wasn't my brother." Another bang shook the walls. This time, the bedroom door trembled violently, the handle jerking as if someone, or something, was trying to get out. Luke lost control. He barked furiously, his body lunging against the door with all his strength. Peter stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Dad, what is happening?" Tom's breath shuddered. "I think," he whispered, his voice hollow. Adam finally found his way back home. The lock on the door clicked. The lock clicked. A sharp, metallic sound that sent a bolt of ice down Peter's spine. Luke went wild, his muscles tensing as he launched himself against the door. His growls turned to frantic barks. Teeth bared, hackles raised. Peter's breath hitched in his throat. His father wasn't moving. Tom just sat there, his face pale, his eyes locked on the door as if he had already accepted what was coming. Peter's heart slammed against his ribs. "Dad, we need to get out of here." Tom didn't respond. Then, with a slow, agonizing creak, the bedroom door swung open. Peter's stomach dropped. The room beyond was dark. An unnatural kind of black that seemed to swallow the dim hallway light. A cold air slithered out, chilling the entire house. And then, a whisper. Not from the room, from inside Peter's head. "Peter." He staggered backward, his pulse spiking. Luke snarled viciously, stepping in front of Peter, his stance wide, blocking the doorway like a barrier between him and whatever was in the room. Something shifted in the shadows. Peter's breath hitched. He couldn't see anything, not clearly, but he felt it. A presence. Something wrong. Then, movement. A shape emerged. At first, it looked like a man. Tall, thin, a familiar outline. Peter's lungs burned, realizing he had been holding his breath. "Adam?" His voice came out hoarse. But the figure didn't react. The thing stepped forward into the dim light. Peter's body locked in fear. It looked like his father, but wrong. The features were almost identical to Tom's, yet distorted. The skin was too smooth, too tight. The mouth stretched wider than it should, its lips curling upward into a thin, unnatural smile. But the worst part were the eyes. They were completely black, hollow, empty. Peter's entire body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. Then the thing spoke. Its voice was a whisper, but it came from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the air around them. "You forgot about me, Tom." Peter felt his father flinch beside him. Tom's breathing turned shallow, ragged. "You're not Adam," he whispered. "You're not real." The thing tilted its head, its lips stretching into an even wider grin. "Aren't I?" Peter couldn't breathe. His hands clenched into fists. He had to do something. Anything. Then, Luke moved. With a feral growl, the pit bull lunged. His body shot forward, powerful and fast, his jaws snapping as he launched himself at the creature. The moment Luke's teeth met flesh, the thing let out a horrible, inhuman shriek. The sound wasn't natural, it was layered, distorted, as if 1,000 voices were screaming at once. Peter jerked forward, his body finally breaking free from the paralyzing fear. Luke didn't let go. His teeth sank deeper, his entire body shaking with the force of his grip. The creature staggered backward, that awful grin twisting into something else, pain, fear. And then, it dissolved. Not like a person, not like an animal, like smoke being sucked into a void. Luke landed hard on the floor, his breathing heavy, his eyes still locked on the empty doorway. The darkness in the room began to recede, fading as if it had never been there. Peter grabbed his father's arm. "Dad, are you okay?" Tom was trembling, his eyes wet, but he nodded. I don't know," he whispered, "but I think it's gone." Peter turned back to Luke, his heart still racing. The pit bull stood tall, his body still tense, his ears alert, waiting, just in case. The silence in the house felt different now, as if the weight of something ancient, something dark, had finally lifted. But Peter couldn't shake one thought. The way that thing had spoken, the way it had whispered his name. Was it really gone? The house had fallen into a deep, unsettling silence. Peter's heart still pounded, his breath unsteady as he stared at the now empty doorway. The thing was gone, or at least, it seemed that way. Luke remained rigid, his body still coiled with tension, ears flicking at every small sound. His eyes didn't move from the doorway, as if expecting the shadow to return at any moment. Peter swallowed, trying to steady his thoughts. His father, Tom, sat frozen beside him on the couch, his wrinkled hands trembling in his lap. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, but his eyes were clearer than before. The encounter had shaken him, but something about it had also pulled him out of the haze that Alzheimer's so often left him in. Peter knelt beside him, gripping his arm. "Dad, talk to me. Are you okay?" Tom's lips quivered, As if struggling to find the right words, he finally whispered, I remember something. Peter stiffened. His father remembering something was rare. Luke let out a soft whine, stepping closer and resting his head on Tom's lap. Tom's fingers found the dog's fur, stroking it absent-mindedly as he spoke. That thing, that voice. He swallowed hard. It called itself Adam. Peter nodded. That name again. It had spoken it before, too. Tom's face twisted, his brows knitting together as if battling through the fog in his mind. Adam was my brother, he murmured. Peter's breath caught in his throat. What? I had a brother. Tom's voice wavered. But we lost him, when we were kids. Peter sat frozen. This was the first time he had ever heard of his father having a brother. Tom kept stroking Luke's fur, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if grounding himself in reality. It was an accident. We were playing by the lake. I was older than him. I was supposed to watch over him. His throat bobbed with a thick swallow. But I looked away, just for a second. Silence fell between them. Peter didn't push him, didn't force him to say more. His father finally met his eyes. His expression filled with something Peter had never seen before, guilt. Raw and unfiltered. I never forgave myself, Tom admitted in a whisper. Peter's chest tightened. Dad, I didn't know. Tom let out a shaky exhale. I don't talk about it. I guess I forgot, or maybe I tried to forget. His hands trembled, but he never left. Peter's skin prickled. You think that thing was him? Tom shook his head. No, it wasn't Adam, but it knew. It knew my guilt, my regret. His voice turned hoarse. It used his name because it knew it would break me. Peter felt his hands clench into fists. Whatever had been in that room, it had fed on his father's sorrow. Luke let out a soft growl, his nose twitching as he stared at the darkness beyond the door. Peter's stomach twisted. Do you think it's really gone? Tom hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. I don't know. Peter's heart sank. The air in the house still felt heavy, like the weight of something unseen still lingered in the walls. The temperature had returned to normal. The shadows had retreated, but that didn't mean it was over. He reached for his phone, dialing the number of an old friend who worked as a priest. Maybe it was time for a blessing on this house. But one thing was certain, whatever darkness had found its way inside, Luke wasn't done protecting them yet. The morning light barely touched the edges of the windows. Yet the air in the house remained heavy, like a storm had passed through but left its shadow behind. Peter hadn't slept. Neither had Luke. The pitbull remained close, his body tense, his eyes sharp, ears flicking toward every creak and whisper of the house settling. Tom, however, had slept more peacefully than Peter had seen in months. The fear that had rattled him had also seemed to awaken something buried deep inside him, a painful truth that his mind had hidden away for decades. But Peter knew it wasn't over. He dialed Father Collins, an old friend of the family and the only man he could think of who might help. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. Finally, a voice picked up. Peter? Peter exhaled. Father, I need help. There was a pause. Is this about your father? Peter hesitated. It's about the house. There's something here, something that shouldn't be. Another silence. When Father Collins finally spoke, his voice was grim. I'll be there by noon. Peter ended the call, his hands still clammy. He glanced down at Luke, who was still staring at the hallway, the same spot where the thing had disappeared. Peter crouched beside him, running a hand over his muscular back. You still feel it, don't you, boy? Luke didn't move, didn't blink. That was all the answer Peter needed. Blank. Blank. Noon came quickly. Father Collins arrived with a small black bag in hand, his weathered face unreadable. He had seen many things in his life, things most wouldn't believe, but when he stepped into the house, his expression darkened immediately. He looked toward the hallway without Peter needing to say a word. Where did it happen? Peter motioned toward the door. There. Father Collins nodded, stepping forward, his hand reaching into his bag. He pulled out a small silver crucifix, his other hand clasping a worn Bible. Luke followed close behind, his low growl vibrating in his chest. Tom sat in the living room, watching the priest with quiet understanding. For once, his mind was clear. Father Collins pressed his palm to the doorframe, closing his eyes. Then, without warning, he flinched, his breath hitched, and he took a slow step back. Peter's stomach clenched. What is it? The priest didn't answer at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he murmured, "It's still here." Peter's blood ran cold. Luke let out a sharp bark, his body coiling like a spring, ready to attack something unseen. Father Collins turned, his eyes grave. "This thing, whatever it isn't just lingering. It's waiting." Peter's mouth went dry. Waiting for what? The priest met his gaze, and his words felt like ice in Peter's veins. For Tom. A deep chill settled over the room, thick and suffocating. Tom's face remained still, but his hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He had known all along. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The air inside the house thickened, the weight of an unseen force pressing down on them like an invisible hand gripping their chests. Luke's stance grew rigid, his muscles tensed like a coiled spring, ready to strike. His eyes flickered toward the darkened hallway, where the presence still lurked, unseen but undeniable. Peter swallowed the fear rising in his throat and turned toward Father Collins. "What do we do?" His voice barely carried, but the priest heard him loud and clear. Father Collins exhaled slowly, gripping the Bible tighter. "We drive it out." Tom, who had been sitting quietly in his chair, suddenly let out a sharp breath, his fingers twitching. He wasn't fully present, his mind drifting between the fog of his illness and the sudden, horrifying clarity of old memories resurfacing. His lips moved soundlessly, as if whispering something only he could hear. Luke's growl deepened. Then the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut on its own. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Peter jumped back, instinctively reaching for Tom, whose body jerked at the noise. Father Collins didn't flinch. He simply reached into his bag, pulling out a small vial of holy water. "It's trying to scare us," he muttered, "but we don't scare that easily." Peter felt his breath quicken. "You're sure about that?" Father Collins ignored him, stepping forward, his voice calm but firm. He began to pray. The moment he did, the temperature in the house plummeted. Peter could see his own breath curling in the air. Luke barked wildly, his nails scraping against the wooden floor as he lunged toward the hallway, his instincts screaming that something was there, something real. Tom groaned suddenly, his body jerking as if something was inside him, pulling him away from reality. His eyes rolled back, and he mumbled incoherently. Peter grabbed his father's shoulders, shaking him gently. "Dad, stay with me." Tom's head snapped forward, his eyes black as night. Peter's heart nearly stopped. Father Collins hurled holy water toward the hallway door, and the reaction was instantaneous. The air rippled, as if something unseen was writhing in pain. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the walls, vibrating through the very foundation of the house. Luke snapped at the air, barking in fury, refusing to back down. Then Tom spoke, but the voice that left his lips wasn't his own. "You can't have him." Peter felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. "Dad?" Tom's eyes blinked rapidly, flickering between black and their normal, familiar brown. His lips trembled. "Peter." His voice was weak, but his next words struck like thunder. "It's inside the house. It's always been here." Father Collins didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, raising his crucifix, his voice unwavering. "In the name of the Lord, I command you to leave this house." The very walls shook. The lights flickered wildly. Luke launched himself forward, snarling at thin air, but Peter knew better. Luke wasn't barking at nothing. There was something there. And then, Tom let out a piercing scream. Peter grabbed his father, gripping his frail body as Tom's back arched, his limbs trembling violently. The force inside him fought to stay. "No," Tom gasped, his old self breaking through. "You don't belong here anymore." With all the strength left in him, Tom pushed against the darkness. His body convulsed once more, then suddenly went still. The air shifted. A deep, eerie silence settled over the house. Peter felt his father collapse into his arms, breathing heavily. Luke lowered his head, sniffing the ground cautiously before letting out a final, deep exhale, as if confirming the battle was over. Father Collins scanned the room, his eyes narrowing. The darkness had lifted, but a strange unease remained. Peter looked at Tom, whose breathing had evened out, his eyes back to their normal state. "Dad?" Tom blinked. Then, for the first time in years, he truly looked at Peter. "Son," he said, his voice tired but clear. "I remember." Peter's throat tightened. "You do?" Tom nodded weakly. Not everything, but enough. Father Collins placed a reassuring hand on Peter's shoulder. It's gone, for now. His expression, however, remained grave. But whatever that was, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something else. Peter swallowed hard, his gaze drifting toward the darkened hallway. He didn't need to be told twice. This wasn't over. Peter sat on the back porch, his gaze lost in the dim light of dawn. The night's events still echoed in his mind, the eerie shadows creeping around the house. The break-in, and how Luke, his fierce yet loyal protector, had stood between them and danger. The pitbull lay beside him now, his muscular body finally at ease, though his amber eyes remained watchful, ever vigilant. Inside, Tom was still asleep, wrapped in the peaceful slumber that had become so rare in recent years. Peter ran a hand over his face, exhaustion pressing on his shoulders. He had known that his father's condition made them vulnerable, but he never expected it would come to this. The very thought of what could have happened sent a shiver down his spine. He reached over, running his fingers through Luke's short fur. "You saved us," Peter murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Luke lifted his head slightly, nudging Peter's hand with his nose before settling back down with a heavy sigh. The police had come and gone, taking the intruders with them, but the unease lingered. The officers had commended Luke's bravery, saying that without him, the outcome could have been much worse. Peter knew they were right. A rustling sound came from the house, and Peter turned just in time to see Tom shuffling toward the doorway. His steps slow but determined. His father's usually distant eyes held a surprising clarity. "Peter," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I remember something." Peter froze, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you remember, Dad?" Tom's gaze drifted to Luke. "The night, the voices outside. I remember feeling afraid, but then I saw him, standing there, guarding me." His lips curled into the smallest of smiles as he lowered himself into the chair beside Peter. "He reminds me of someone." Peter frowned. "Who?" Tom looked up at the sky, as if trying to grasp a fading memory. "When I was young, before I met your mother, I had a dog. His name was Duke. Strong, loyal, just like Luke." He turned to the pitbull, who was now watching him intently. "He saved me once, too." A lump formed in Peter's throat. His father barely remembered his own son at times. But here he was, recalling a dog from his past. And somehow, in the midst of all the darkness, Luke had brought that memory back. Peter exhaled deeply, a warmth spreading through his chest. "Maybe that's why he's here," he said softly, "to remind us of the things we can't afford to forget." Tom nodded, reaching out to stroke Luke's head with a trembling hand. The dog closed his eyes, leaning into the touch, as if he, too, understood the significance of the moment. For the first time in a long time, Peter felt something he hadn't dared to in years: hope. He didn't know what the future held for them, or how long he'd have with his father before the disease took him further away. But he did know this: they weren't alone. Luke had come into their lives when they needed him most, not just as a protector, but as a bridge to a past that Tom was slowly losing. The sun began to rise, bathing the horizon in golden hues. Peter sat back, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. Luke, their silent guardian, had not just saved them from danger, he had saved something even more precious. Memories, connection, family. And no matter what lay ahead, Peter knew one thing for certain: Luke wasn't just their dog. He was their lifeline. The story of Peter, Tom, and Luke teaches us a powerful lesson about loyalty, protection, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us, even in the most challenging moments. Luke, a stray pit bull who arrived at their doorstep unexpectedly, was more than just a guard dog. He became a silent protector, a source of comfort, and ultimately, a bridge between a fading past and an uncertain future. One of the key takeaways from this story is that sometimes, the most unexpected companions come into our lives at precisely the moment we need them most. Luke wasn't just there to fend off intruders, he became a living reminder of Tom's lost memories, sparking a connection to the past that Alzheimer's had slowly been erasing. His presence gave Tom a reason to engage, to remember, and to hold on to a piece of himself that had been slipping away. The story also highlights the importance of listening to the instincts of those around us, especially animals. Luke sensed danger before Peter did, proving that animals often perceive threats that humans overlook. In life, we are sometimes so consumed by our own struggles that we fail to see the warnings around us. Trusting our instincts, and those of the companions who truly care for us, can make all the difference. Lastly, this story reminds us that family isn't just defined by blood. True family is found in those who stand by us, who protect us, and who never give up on us, even when we are at our most vulnerable. Luke's unwavering devotion to Tom and Peter proves that love, in its purest form, transcends words, memories, and even time itself.